Hi, I want to welcome everybody. Good to be with you. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. Thank you so much for joining us today for our special colloquium webinar on Frederick Douglass's American Identity Politics. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Peter Myers, an old friend of the center, a good friend of myself and many other folks here at Ashbrook. And we're glad that you could join us today. Most of you, I think, know about the center, but for those of you who may not, we're an independent educational center located at Ashland University. We run programs here on the campus for undergraduate students called our Ashbrook Scholar Program. And I know we have many of our Ashbrook Scholars joining us today for this colloquium, but we also run programs around the country for students, teachers, and citizens. And we're delighted to have folks, supporters and friends of ours from around the country with us as well today. So welcome. This webinar, this colloquium is part of our mission at Ashbrook, which is to strengthen constitutional self-government by educating our fellow Americans, whether those are students, teachers, or citizens, in the history and founding principles of our country. That's what we're devoted to here at Ashbrook. And we like to do that by way of conversation. And so we're going to be having a conversation today with Dr. Myers, because we really believe that education is not about simply receiving, ingesting information, and definitely not about indoctrination, but about discovering the truth for yourself. And we think the best way to do that discovery is through conversation, whether it's conversation with great minds like Frederick Douglass, whether it's in conversation with Professor Myers, or with ourselves and each other. So please join us in that conversation today. We'll use if you have questions as they come up, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, but Q&A, so that we can make sure to get to as many questions as possible. We may not be able to get to them all. I know this is a really interesting topic for scholars and citizens and teachers who may be joining us. So we may have a lot of questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. And as I said, we're joined today by Dr. Peter Myers, who is professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. He received his bachelor's degree from Northwestern University and his PhD and master's from Loyola University. His dissertation on John Locke won the prize, the Strauss Prize, for the best dissertation in political philosophy in that year. So he got off to a distinguished start as a scholar and has continued that trajectory. And we're delighted to have him with us. In fact, Professor Myers is a longtime teacher in Ashbrook's Master of Arts in American History and Government program and our Teaching American History program. And I was just looking, Peter, at some of the courses you've taught. Looks like at least a number of them: Race and Equality in America, the Civil Rights Movement, Democracy in America, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King Jr., all of those.
And also Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln, okay.
Yeah, they allowed me to talk about Lincoln the first time this last summer.
And one of the things that we've found working with Professor Myers is he's a wonderful teacher. He's a very smart guy, but he's also a great teacher who knows how to bring alive the minds of people like Douglass and King and Lincoln. We thought it'd be a great opportunity for him to come on this Martin Luther King Day to have a discussion about one of the antecedents in many ways of Dr. King, Frederick Douglass. He's also a great scholar, Dr. Myers. Has been a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation at their Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies. And he has written widely on political philosophy and American political thought. Many articles on John Locke, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and of course, a couple of really good books, absolutely first rate. One is on John Locke called Our Only Star and Compass, John Locke and the Struggle for Political Rationality. And another one more recently on Frederick Douglass called Frederick Douglass, Race and the Rebirth of American Liberalism. So he's well qualified to be here with us today, and delighted that you could be with us, Peter. Maybe I can get us started by talking a little bit, asking you to talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass, because he's a figure in American history that a lot of us have probably heard of. The students who are joining us today and citizens from around the country, they probably know something, like the name sounds familiar. but it's possible that they don't know, and we don't know much about Douglass, the person, the man. Can you start us off in this conversation by giving us a little bit of Frederick Douglass's really interesting biography?
I can try. I guess I would, before we get into the details of it, I would summarize Douglass just by saying that I think the two greatest apostles, perhaps, of the natural rights doctrine of natural rights republicanism in America in the 19th century were Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And there's some stiff competition for those honors, but those are the two I would name. Douglass is a great story. Sometimes I gave a talk at Heritage one time that I introduced with the following line that seemed to me kind of fun. A long time ago, I wrote an article about Mark Twain, and in the course of writing that, I dug up this story that Mark Twain apparently scribbled some friend of his remark into his own notebook that said, "I am not an American. I am the American." And you can imagine Mark Twain saying that. And in a way, you can imagine Frederick Douglass saying that also. Frederick Douglass, I think, presented his life in a way, and he wrote his autobiography 3 times, presented his life as kind of, as a great American story, which partly means a rags to riches story, but it partly also means a story of that begins in racial division, and I don't know if I want to say ends in a simple unity or harmony or state of integration, but it's certainly that's its trajectory. And I mean, Douglass was a guy who rose from the lowest of the lows, almost the lowest of the lows, to almost the highest of the heights, really, in American politics. Those are kind of summative remarks. I don't want to go on and on and on about his life story in detail. So as I told you, you might have to cut me off. But here are some essentials. Douglass was born. He wasn't born Douglass, by the way. He was born Frederick Bailey in 1818, February 1818, and he was born enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland. And his mother, of course, was an enslaved woman. His father, he says he doesn't know the identity of his father. And historians to this day will say, I think, so they will express an opinion as to the identity, but they'll say it really isn't known. And Douglass never himself did know who his father was. I'm more in recent years inclined to doubt that a little bit, but if somebody wants to ask me about that, we can get further into that. At any rate, those are circumstances of Douglass's birth. He had the good fortune of being sent to Baltimore to be a house slave, actually, for the brother of the person who actually had title to him as a property. And in the course of his time in Baltimore, he learned how to read. He was the slave mistress was a woman, not a very young woman, not terribly comfortable with slavery. And young Frederick asked her, and she was teaching her own boy to reading the Bible with him. And Frederick asked her, he would have been maybe 9 years old or so at this time, asked her, "Will you teach me too?" And she did. And it's a great story about what happens when the husband finds out about that. But that again is maybe something we can talk about further. Literacy was something he really strove to develop. And literacy was, of course, ultimately a very great blessing to him, but it was in the near term kind of a curse because it made him terribly unhappy with being enslaved. Not that he wouldn't have been anyway. So to compress the story a little bit, He's unhappy throughout his teen years. He resolves to escape. He tries to escape once and fails. Then he succeeds as a 20-year-old. So this is in 1838, and he escapes, eventually winds up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, works as a day laborer for a few years, goes to abolition meetings, and winds up being asked to speak at one of those meetings where William Lloyd Garrison was present. Garrison is knocked out by Douglass's story. He had taken the name Frederick Douglass by this time. Garrison is knocked out. Garrison asks him to become an itinerant lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, which Frederick agreed to do. And he pretty quickly becomes famous after that. He published his first autobiography in 1845, published the second one in 1855, and in the meantime, he had broken with the Garrisonians. He was originally a Garrisonian. This again is an interesting part of his story. Comes to have certain basic disagreements with the Garrisonians, and kind of sets out on his own, becomes the publisher of his own newspaper, anti-slavery newspaper, becomes a very prominent figure among the abolitionists. Fast forward a little bit again, after the Civil War commences, he becomes, first of all, a very severe critic of Abraham Lincoln, and then later, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, becomes a kind of a friend, really. They had a very cordial, friendly relation, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln invited him to the White House to make an interesting proposal to him. Again, another interesting part of the story. And then after, I'll compress this now and bring it to the close. After the Civil War, Douglass had a couple of political appointments. He made a pretty good living, actually, as a speaker still. He, of course, continued to write, continued to advocate. He was the greatest, I suppose, civil rights advocate in the post-war decades. An advocate of women's suffrage, by the way, also, and then and finally died in 1895. So that's about as brief as I can do in talking about Douglass's life.
Take us back to when he escapes to the North, escapes from slavery, and meets William Lloyd Garrison. Some folks listening, again, have probably heard the name. They may not know William Lloyd Garrison. Tell us a little bit about him and about his early relationship with Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, let's talk a little about Garrison. Garrison was born in Massachusetts, was really quite impoverished as a youth, which meant he had to go to work as a young man, and he worked as a kind of a printer's apprentice. So he kind of got acquainted with the publishing business. He migrated to Baltimore for a couple years. I can't remember exactly how long. And he worked with an abolitionist in Baltimore in those days. Garrison was born, by the way, in 1805, so he's a little bit older than Douglass. But in his younger days, you're just about coming to the end of the time where one could be safely an abolitionist in the Upper South. And so Benjamin Lundy ran this paper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation, and Garrison worked with him. In effect, both of them were run out of town, and Garrison returns to Massachusetts and becomes the founder of, first of all, the Massachusetts and then New England Anti-Slavery Society, and then the American Anti-Slavery Society. He becomes an anti-slavery activist, and so he was for the rest of the time when there was slavery in America. And he starts a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, where he promises to take the most radical, uncompromising positions with regard to slavery. This is in the course of the development of anti-slavery sentiment in the US. The rise of Garrison is a moment, because you had plenty of anti-slavery sentiment at the time of the founding, but it tended to be gradualist and relatively moderate. And Garrison's position was that slavery had to be abolished immediately, abolished without compensation, and the aftermath had to be not colonization, of the formerly enslaved people, but rather full integration, full equality under the law in American society. And these were North and South. These were very, very controversial positions, and so the anti-slavery societies essentially did their business by trying to raise money where they could, hiring itinerant speakers to just send forth and talk to whatever audiences would listen to them about anti-slavery. And so that was Garrison in the 1830s. One last thing about Garrison. When I say that Garrison was a radical, insisted on an uncompromising position, the thing to know about Garrison, I should say a little more about Garrison and Douglass. The thing to know about Garrison in this respect is that Garrison thought that the US Constitution was a fundamentally pro-slavery document. Garrison took essentially the same reading of the Constitution as Roger Taney, Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott ruling would take decades down the road. And Garrison, not all right at once, but over time, Garrison derived this inference from it. This will give you an idea of the cast of Garrison's mind, that because the Constitution is anti-slavery, this meant to him the fundamental law of the United States. I'm sorry, because the Constitution is pro-slavery, I misspoke. Because of that, the fundamental law of the United States is pro-slavery and therefore illegitimate. And therefore, a person of conscience could not properly participate in US politics under the Constitution so long as that was the law of the land. Now, that was a doctrine to be applied in Garrison's mind, not just at the level of individuals. Don't vote, instead, don't use political means, try to persuade slaveholders, to give up their institution just by moral suasion was the term. It wasn't only an individualist position. He meant it to be a political position. It was an invitation to secession. He thought that the non-slave holding states should leave the Union. The slogan, the Garrisonian slogan was "No union with slaveholders." And so this is the teaching that now when Frederick Douglass first comes in, becomes acquainted with the Liberator, he subscribes instantly and he loves it, and he loves Garrison. And so through the most of the 1840s, Frederick Douglass is a Garrisonian, and he pretty much accepts these doctrines about the right kind of abolitionism, the right approach to abolition, and then he changes his mind about the Constitution, and that's the break. And they're all stopped for now.
Tell us about that break, because we've got a question already from one of our folks watching who says, tell us the difference between anti-slavery and abolitionism. Sounds like Frederick Douglass has become a radical under the spell of William Lloyd Garrison. How radical is Frederick Douglass? So for example, people might know John Brown, who becomes extremely radical and even violent as an abolitionist. Where does Frederick Douglass fit on this spectrum of anti-slavery and abolitionism when we get to the 1840s and 50s?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are a couple of questions in that. Yeah, Garrison was a radical. Frederick Douglass was a radical. And I think if we're seeing the world through Frederick Douglass's eyes, he would not say that he became less radical after he broke with Garrison. I mean, I think there's a legitimate sense in which he did, but there's a sense in which he didn't. I mean, for one thing, to pick up on the last point first, Douglass was quite friendly with John Brown. They met in 1847, and the influence of John Brown was one of the things that that persuaded Douglass against the Garrisonian view. The Garrisonians were not only non-political because they objected to the Constitution. Some of them were non-political because they embraced this really radicalized form of Protestantism, according to which all human government ultimately is illegitimate. All rule of people who are capable of action by moral conscience is, I mean, all forcible rule is, coercive rule is illegitimate. And so the Garrisonians, in a certain sense, are kind of anti-government. They got called anarchists, and Garrison didn't like the term because he said, no, we believe in government, but it's just that we believe in the government of God, not in human government, okay? No, so all of that means not only, can you not abolish slavery by any mechanism provided in the US Constitution, you can't abolish slavery by force. And Douglass, partly under the, I shouldn't say under the influence, Douglass, in conversation with John Brown, and I think based on his own experience, came to believe that slavery would not be abolished voluntarily. That if slavery were to be abolished, it would have to be by force. And maybe that would be governmental force, or maybe it would be some other kind of force. But this is what he and John Brown came to agree on. And so Douglass becomes a political, quote unquote, political abolitionist or constitutional abolitionist, beginning in the formal announcement in about 1851. Backtracking a bit, question between different meanings of being anti-slavery and abolitionist. I guess maybe different people can answer that different ways, but here's how I would make the distinction. I would say the anti-slavery position is a kind of larger universe of positions that includes the abolitionist position, but it isn't identical with it. Abolitionists, I would say, are those who demand the immediate abolition, cessation of slavery, okay? One can be anti-slavery in the sense that, say, James Madison or Thomas Jefferson, or for that matter, Abraham Lincoln, was anti-slavery, meaning that, let's take Lincoln, who very firmly and clearly objected to slavery on moral grounds, clearly a violation of natural right. But Lincoln did not call himself an abolitionist because he didn't believe in demanding immediate abolition, because he thought, I think, the consequences of that would be civil war. So Lincoln was a gradualist, and Lincoln also believed that the Constitution was anti-slavery, but did not provide the federal government with the power to abolish slavery in the states. So anti-slavery had to be a more gradualist kind of position. But the abolitionists want it done right now, more or less by any means necessary. And yeah, I'll say something just that, at least that I take to be sort of tantalizing here, that Douglass's reading of the Constitution went from one radical extreme to another. I mean, the first reading is Garrisonian. The second reading that he adopts into the 1850s, it goes way beyond Lincoln. It's not just that the Constitution is anti-slavery. It's that in Douglass's view, the Constitution is actually abolitionist. And this means, and you can see two possible levels of that, and Douglass takes the most radical level of that. The two possible levels would be these. If you said that the Constitution empowers the federal government to abolish slavery instantly and everywhere, in the states as well as the territories, that would be a quite radical position. Now, Douglass took that position, but his position was even more radical than that. It's not only that the Constitution empowers the federal government to do this, the Constitution obligates the federal government to do this. Slavery, in Douglass's reading, it's not quite original with him, but slavery in Douglass's reading was unconstitutional. And so it could have been abolished by the Congress, but it could have and should have been abolished by a federal judicial power. because it was actually a violation of the Constitution. All
And
right.
where does he get that radical stand from? Is it that he's looking around saying this other kind of abolitionism is not working, we're not making headway? Or does he say, no, go back to the American founders, they believed this too?
Some of both. I think he came to think. There's a nice quotation in the Dred Scott speech. I'll dig it up in a second, maybe, and read it. But he came to think that Garrisonian abolitionism was a dead end. That this idea of disunion was. I think maybe I wrote it down somewhere in the remarks I made to prepare for this. The Garrisonian disunion position would have the effect, I mean, if anybody really took it seriously and did it, would have the effect of just leaving the people enslaved to fend for themselves. And Douglass thought this would be suicide. So that makes no sense. So it's partly that. The story he tells in My Bondage and My Freedom, which is the second of his autobiographies, is I started changing my mind about the Constitution when I became the editor of my own paper. It's kind of a long story, but Douglass had been compelled after writing the narrative to spend, I think it was 17 months in the British Isles. Because in the narrative, he was a fugitive slave still in the narrative. He wasn't a legally free man, and he divulged his identity. And so he kind of put a target on his back. And so he left to do a tour of abolition speaking in Great Britain. So he made a lot of friends, and he became a kind of celebrity in Great Britain. And some of his British friends gathered up some money, and they purchased his freedom. So he returned in 1847 a free man. And they gave him money. They urged him to start a newspaper. They gave him money to purchase a printing press. Garrison wasn't thrilled with that decision, partly didn't want the competition with the Liberator, partly didn't think it was necessary, maybe, necessary to add another abolition paper. Maybe there were further motives also. And things became kind of ugly between Douglass and Garrison at this point. But anyway, Douglass says when he became an editor, he thought it was his responsibility to provide a forum for all different kinds of anti-slavery voices. And so he began to read more widely, and he became acquainted with the political abolition side of things. And eventually, I think what eventually means really not very long. By 1849, he's starting to doubt the Garrisonian view. By 1851, he's convinced that it's wrong. He was reading other interpreters of the Constitution, and foremost among them is a cranky old character named Lysander Spooner, who was a kind of libertarian in some ways, who wrote a book called Unconstitutionality of Slavery, I think first published in 1845. And Douglass's arguments track fairly closely with Spooner's arguments. So that's where it comes from.
So we get to about 1850. He's developed his own thinking on the question of slavery and abolition and the Constitution. He's come along to the view that the Constitution is anti-slavery and empowers or even obligates the federal government to attack slavery. So he's really not a Garrisonian anymore, as you say. But the 1850s, I know that you've written about the stand that Douglass takes on the Compromise of 1850, which is a really important moment in American life, sort of a precursor in many ways, people say, of the Civil War. Looks like the country's going to come apart on the issue of slavery. We get a compromise in 1850. We get the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and then we get bloody Kansas after that. Take us through the 1850s, up to the eve of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass in his life and in his thought.
Okay, pardon me. I got to duck out of the screen for a second because I got to get a book because there's a great passage. There's a great passage in in Douglas's Dred Scott speech that I want to read in a second about that. But about the 1850s more generally, I think this picks up on the topic especially that I was trying to suggest in the title to the talk today, to the discussion today, the American identity politics, because the evolution of Douglas's reading on the Constitution is an interesting part of the story. In a deeper sense, the evolution of Douglas's thinking with regard to the question of American patriotism, American identity, is also a very interesting and important part of the story. So let's start in 1850. You mentioned the 1850 Compromise. From Douglas's point of view, from the abolitionist point of view, the really horrible thing about the 1850 Compromise was the fugitive slave law. There had been, pursuant to a passage in Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, the so-called Fugitive Slave Clause, there had been since 1793 a federal fugitive slave law on the books. But as sectional divisions start to heat up, later 1840s, especially after the Mexican War and into the 1850s, slaveholders are demanding a strengthened fugitive slave law, and they got it in the 1850 law, the details of which I don't know that we need to get into too much right now, but it could suffice to say that what that law did was, in effect, to expose all Black Americans, those legally free in particular, to a kind of legalized kidnapping, because what it meant was that if slaveholders or their people in their employ, slave hunters, wanted to venture into non-slave holding states and in effect seize Black people, Black citizens, in many cases they would have been, seize them and accuse them of being fugitive slaves. Then there would be a judicial hearing about that. But according to the fugitive slave law, the odds were very much stacked against somebody accused of being a fugitive. So someone seizes you and says that you're a fugitive, you're coming with us. In virtually all cases, that's what would actually happen to them. That's what I mean when I say legalized kidnapping. So a lot of Black Americans in the northern states are thinking, we've got no protection anywhere. And tens of thousands of them emigrated to Canada. And around this time, there's a character, well known to students of African American political thought, maybe less well known, in the mainstream, named Martin Delaney, who publishes a book in 1852 advocating. Martin Delaney was a Black man, a free Black man, very highly educated man, partnered with Douglass for a brief time, publishing the North Star, Douglass's paper. But Delaney was a kind of early Black nationalist, and Delaney was an emigrationist. Delaney's argument in the book he published in 1852 was, there's really no hope for the United States within the foreseeable future. There's no hope for the cause of freedom. So what we should do, we Black Americans should do, is emigrate, and so he spends a lot of time in the book talking about where we should go. But we should give up hope in the country. And Douglass argued against that position, but the position, you could think, had a certain force to it because of the existence of the fugitive slave law. And then, as you say, as the decade proceeds, you get the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially undid the Missouri Compromise and opened up the Kansas-Nebraska territories to the influx of slavery. And then the Dred Scott ruling, which endorsed the radically pro-slavery reading of the Constitution. And if you're an abolitionist, you could be forgiven for thinking, we've been at this for nearly 30 years and this is hopeless. You know, we've been trying our best to talk the country into an anti-slavery position and we've just failed. All of the institutions of the country, presidency, Congress, judiciary, and so forth, are lined up against us here and endorsing this pro-slavery position. It'd be easy, you know, to lose faith. And Douglass is insistent in the most famous of his speeches in 1852 that no, you know, we are Americans, and we are Americans not just by necessity but by choice, and we have to remain so. We have to embrace an American identity.
How could Douglass, in the face of all of that opposition, and as you say, it looks like the national institutions of government, Congress, presidency, Supreme Court, lots of states, all look like they're going the wrong direction. They all look like they're going the pro-slavery direction. All of the forces that the abolitionists have been struggling against seem like they're winning, and the abolitionists, as you say, are losing. How could Frederick Douglass, in 1857, after the Dred Scott decision, how could he be hopeful still?
Yeah.
Is it his character? Is it his own political thinking? Is it something else that he saw?
That's a very good question. Douglass, I think partly Douglass was a man just in character, a forward-looking, upward-looking sort of man. I mean, he ends virtually all of his speeches with an expression of hopefulness. But I would suggest that Douglass's hopefulness is not just a faith in things unseen. That is, it's not ungrounded by reason and evidence. As I'm talking to you, I'm looking at the passage that I was mentioning a couple of minutes ago that I was going to read, which I'm going to read partly because it's one of my favorite sentences in all of Douglass's work, but it suggests an answer to your question too. When he summarizes, this is in his speech he gave on the Dred Scott decision in 1857, and he summarizes the course of events in the 1850s, and he says, loud and exultingly, his words now, have we been told that the slavery question is settled and settled forever? You remember, it was settled 37 years ago when Missouri was admitted into the Union with a slaveholding constitution. Just 15 years afterward, it was settled again by voting down the right of petition and gagging down free discussion in Congress. 10 years after that, settled again by the annexation of Texas. 1850, it was again settled. This was called the final settlement. By it, slavery was virtually declared to be the equal of liberty and should come into the Union on equal terms. And then he goes on, 4 years after this settlement, this is my favorite sentence, 4 years after this settlement, the whole question was once more settled, and settled by a settlement that unsettled all the former settlements. Okay. And then next paragraph, the fact is the more the question has been settled, the more it has needed settling. Okay. Now, a couple of thoughts here. One of them is, he says, you know, the time frame is important. That, you know, these settlements are lasting for shorter and shorter durations. The question is heating up even as the country is trying desperately to compromise with it, desperately to settle the issue. And I think Douglass's point in part is that tells you something, that what it tells you is this question can't be settled by any solution short of emancipation. And the reason it can't, to put it first really kind of simply and bluntly, the reason it can't is that the Declaration of Independence is true. For the Declaration of Independence to be true, meaning for it to be actually true that human beings are endowed with natural, unalienable rights, including the right to liberty, at least two things further have to be true. People have to be rational beings capable of self-government, thus capable of liberty. But people also have to desire liberty. There has to be a desire to defend it, not just a capability of exercising it. And with the desire to defend it, I think Douglas' position is part the same as Abraham Lincoln's position. Everyone knows, every human being knows that slavery is wrong for themselves, right? And so deep down, he says, all the slaveholders have an anti-slavery conscience. That anti-slavery conscience is not going to go away. You know, it can be suppressed by one's interests, but it's not going to ever go away. This question is always going to disturb U.S. politics until it is resolved in favor of liberty. And that was part of his hopefulness, is just a hopefulness in human nature. Part of his hopefulness is a hopefulness that the founding really is anti-slavery, Declaration and Constitution. And patriotism is a certain natural sentiment among people, and people's natural American patriotism is going to incline them in an anti-slavery direction. And there, I think, are other causes for his hopefulness also. Well, yeah, let me mention just one further here, because this plays a prominent part in the Dred Scott decision. He shares this, among other things, with Martin Luther King Jr. I think Douglas would say the anti-slavery cause ultimately is going to be blessed by the character of its adversaries. And that meant that this whole history in the 1850s means that the slaveholders are in a process of overreaching. They're going to get overconfident. They're going to overreach. When they overreach, that means they're going to start violating the rights of white Americans, as well as, I shouldn't say as well, but in the company of their violations of the rights of Black Americans. And when they do that, they're going to enrage the North about slavery. And eventually that's going to build a coalition that's going to undo it. That's kind of hinted at in the Dred Scott speech. There's an editorial he wrote a few years previous called "The Doom of the Black Power." The Black Power wasn't Black Power in the sense we understand the term. The Black Power was slavery. The Doom of the Black Power, in which he predicts this kind of overreach, which I think in a way eventually is what happened.
So this kind of overreach, in part, you see it with the formation of the Republican Party in the 1850s, right? You have Free Soil Democrats, you have people alarmed by the rush to impose slavery on Kansas. You have some abolitionist types, and then you have someone like Lincoln somewhere in there. But this sort of political party forming in the 1850s to stop the spread of slavery, at least into the West. Is Frederick Douglass, does he become a Republican?
It takes a while, but it takes a while, but he does. He's not satisfied with the Republicans early on because he thinks their position is a kind of halfway position. He thinks that the Republicans need to be more assertive and aggressive against slavery than they are, that their gradualism might take a very, very long time. But he also has a certain faith that they will move in the right direction, that the logic of their own position will make them more firmly or radically anti-slavery as events develop and time passes. And so in the 1850s, his characteristic actions as a voter were, he would advocate for radical abolitionist candidates where they arose, over against Republicans. He would spend lots of time, campaigning, for them, at least in his writing. And then as the election drew very near, he would say, when it became clear that they had no chance of winning, he would say, well, he'd throw his support to the Republican. And so when Lincoln got elected, he was cautiously optimistic that, he thought that, okay, from Douglas's point of view, there was much to be to be objected to or to be unsatisfied with in Lincoln's position, but this is a tremendously important fact that in 1860, the United States has elected to the presidency a representative of a formerly anti-slavery party.
Yeah.
This is unprecedented.
I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that you think two of the greatest Americans of the 19th century are Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. We're here at this point of the story where it's 1860, Lincoln is elected. In many ways, and I know this from your own writing, you say that, just as Mark Twain could say, I am the American, Frederick Douglass could say, I am the American, rose, escaped, freed himself from slavery, essentially, brought himself up to a position in society that was really remarkable for a man like him in his day. Same thing is true of Abraham Lincoln, right? That he rises from extremely humble circumstances to become a very prominent person and even get elected president in 1860. What's the relationship like between Lincoln and Douglass? At the beginning of the Civil War and through, these two great Americans, they agree at least that slavery is wrong. Does that mean they like each other? Does that mean they get along? Does that mean they agree?
This is a great story. I think this is really one of the great stories in American political history. About the first point about Lincoln as kind of the representative American, along with Douglass, along with Mark Twain, you could add along with Ben Franklin, in a different way. Douglass himself said that about Lincoln. Douglass's most popular speech in the post-war decades was called Self-Made Men. And in that speech, he calls Lincoln the king of American self-made men. And he eulogized Lincoln at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C., the statue that activists tried to tear down this past summer. But when he gave that speech, he called Lincoln an American of the Americans, which meant different things, but in part it meant Lincoln came from nothing, and Lincoln kind of was a man of toil, Douglass called him, and kind of worked his way up to the top. And so I think that in that way, Douglass had a kind of personal sympathy with Lincoln's story, and vice versa. Lincoln understood, of course, very well the modesty of his own beginnings, and acquired a certain sympathy for people enslaved, I think, as a consequence of that. As to the development of their friendship, it really takes twists and turns. When Lincoln first comes on Douglass's radar screen was when Lincoln gave the House Divided speech, which is a pretty uncompromising position about slavery, that that the two are irreconcilable and so forth. And Douglass loved that speech. On the other hand, after Lincoln got elected president, Douglass listens to Lincoln's first inaugural, which says very, very little about slavery, and does its best to try to patch up the Union, suggests certain concessions to slavery that Lincoln says are really already in the Constitution, so I don't mind making them. And all of that was very unsatisfactory to the radical abolitionists. So Douglass has very, very harsh things to say about Lincoln's first inaugural address. Then Fort Sumter, and Douglass is pleasantly surprised that the Union actually is going to go to war against the so-called Confederacy. And he thinks that the war naturally and inevitably will have to be an anti-slavery war. And Lincoln's public remarks from, say, well, March of 1861, April 1861, up to, I guess, September of 1862, suggests that Lincoln didn't share that view. That in the common reading, which I think needs a bit of correction, but the common reading, Lincoln thought the war was all about Union and not about slavery, and if we could restore the Union with slavery, then we do that. And Douglass, of course, is very unhappy with that position. After Emancipation Proclamation, much happier. This is the time when the two of them first meet personally. Douglass went to the White House to lobby Lincoln. In these days, you could go to the White House and actually get a hearing with the president. He went to the White House to lobby Lincoln about including Black Americans in the Union Army, let them fight for Black American freedom. And Lincoln, with some qualifications, was, of course, eventually was willing to do that. Douglass, I guess, went to him specifically to lobby for the better, fairer treatment of the Blacks in the Union Army. And Lincoln agreed that it was unjust and was kind of cautiously in favor of taking certain measures. So that's how that meeting goes. Now we go forward a bit. What finally turned Douglass into a pretty much unqualified fan, admirer of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he thought that Lincoln treated him very cordially and respectfully, and he was very impressed by that in their first meeting. But the second meeting is in the summer of 1864, and that time Lincoln summons Douglass to the White House. And the context is very interesting. Lincoln at the time thought it was likely that he was going to lose the 1864 election. And he thought, and he was confident, that if he lost the 1864 election, the consequence is going to be that a newly elected Democratic president is going to sue for peace, is going to allow the Confederates to go their way, is going to bring an end to this long and horribly bloody war. But that means that that slavery is going to remain in the Confederacy for whoever knows, who knows how long, right? So Lincoln is very worried about this, and he summons Douglass because he wants Douglass to come up with a kind of plan whereby as many people enslaved as possible could be not just encouraged, but actually helped in escaping slavery before it was too late. And Douglass writes in his third autobiography, when he said that to me, I mean, what Lincoln was proposing actually was something very like the original plan that John Brown proposed to Douglass. Not the taking over of Harper's Ferry, of a federal arsenal, but this is something like what John Brown had originally wanted to do. And Douglass was on board with that. So Douglass says this in the third autobiography, when Lincoln proposed this, then I knew, that his anti-slavery feeling really was moral, not just sort of legalistic, that he showed me a deeper anti-slavery feeling than I had, ever seen from him before. Now, I think it was always there, but Douglass didn't really know this about Lincoln. And this very much impressed him. And then Lincoln, there's a really charming story that I won't go on and on about because I know we're short on time, but Lincoln treated Douglass not just with respect, but with a high degree of admiration on an occasion in Lincoln, at a reception right after Lincoln's second inaugural address, when he said in this sort of booming voice, in the middle of a big crowded ballroom, here comes my friend, Frederick Douglass, and kind of ushers him to the front of the line. But that's enough on that, I guess.
That's a remarkable statement for that day and time. Yes. Let's go through the end of the Civil War. After the assassination of Lincoln, we're getting a number of questions now about the legacy of Frederick Douglass, about his thought and his life after the Civil War, and what you see as his legacy for today. In fact, we got one question asking you to compare the thought of Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. as it pertains to their idea that the struggle for civil rights is really a patriotic struggle. So could you talk about the legacy of Douglass right after the Civil War and maybe some thoughts about how that echoes into our time today?
Okay. What Douglass spent his time doing, quickly, I have to be, I guess, after the Civil War, is arguing for the proper reading of and the full enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And he was very disappointed at certain Supreme Court decisions the civil rights cases of 1883 in particular that nullified the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And disappointed, of course, that the 15th Amendment wasn't enforced in such a way to enfranchise blacks, because that's what the freed people, Douglass's position was that that's what they need most of all. They need the right to vote, and other things will follow. They need three things. They need voting rights, they need opportunities for education, and they need opportunities to acquire land. I mean, they need, in other words, economic independence. But the latter two of those things would follow from the right to vote. And so that's what he spends his time. That's what he spends his time doing. I guess when we talk about his bigger legacy, in my mind, at least, the best quick way to summarize it is to say that Douglass, I'm going to speak kind of in ideological terms or political philosophy terms. Douglass was a classical liberal. I mean, not a libertarian necessarily, but he was a classical liberal. And so that meant that what Douglass thought government ought to be doing for Black Americans was securing their actual rights, rights of speech, rights of property, right to vote, right of association, those kinds of traditional constitutional rights that you find enshrined in the Bill of Rights. And I think the legacy of Douglass is that he was a profound racial integrationist. I mean, a lot of people know that Douglass's second wife, after his first wife died, his second wife was a white woman, and this was controversial at the time. And Douglass ventured a prediction that, down the road, he thinks the United States is going to be an amalgamated society in which blacks and whites are going to be commonly family members, not just inhabitants of the same continent, not just even fellow citizens. So the integrationism is a very important part. When I say American identity politics in the title, I mean, one should emphasize American, American and universalist, not particularized, racialized identity politics. So that's a thing to bear in mind about Douglass. With regard to King, really quickly, I think there are very important common grounds, and there's also a distinction. The common grounds are that King thought it very, very important for the civil rights cause, the racial equal rights cause, to position itself in the mainstream of American politics. So King argued, in the most famous of the speeches, the Dream Speech, this is the promise of America. This is the meaning of the founding, a fully integrated America across color lines. Okay, now that's a proposition that not all founders would have endorsed, but it's absolutely 100% in agreement with Frederick Douglass's reading that we have to defend the founding. It is defensible, and it's also shrewd for us to do so. So on that point, they're in perfect agreement. But King, on the other hand, with regard to what to do about the legacy, the lingering effects of racialized injustice, there's a difference. And to put it in the briefest terms, I said a little while ago, Douglass is a classical liberal. He's basically a Lockean in his approach to property rights and governmental power. King isn't. King is a social democrat. King is a progressive with regard to, so what King wanted was an enormously expanded war on poverty, in LBJ's Great Society. I'm not sure Douglass would have wanted that. So they would have had different anti-poverty visions. But with regard to the fundamental Americanness of the movements, they would have been in agreement.
Wow, thank you very much. Wow, so much ground covered. But Peter, we appreciate you taking the time with us today. What an appropriate reflection on this Martin Luther King Day to spend some time with a great American like Frederick Douglass. If there's one last question we've got from our audience, the person asks, what one thing do you think is most misunderstood about Frederick Douglass that you would like Americans to know?
Gosh, I'm not sure I can answer that right off the top of my head. What's the is there a common misunderstanding of Frederick Douglass?
How about
I
this?
wish
How
I,
about
you
this?
know,
What one thing would you like students and teachers and citizens watching this to take away about Frederick Douglass that you think makes him so exceptional?
yeah, I think they, you know, let me maybe let me put it this way. I mean, I think, okay, here I'll say something maybe slightly controversial, but this could be an answer to both those questions. I think, with all due respect to all of his colleagues, you know, slash competitors for this honor, I think Frederick Douglass is the greatest American apostle of civil rights, equal rights, with regard to race. And I think it's usually said when people study these things, well, he's the greatest in the 19th century, you know, but MLK is the greatest. And I don't want to say anything disrespectful of Martin Luther King Jr. on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I don't. I think King had, on balance, an enormously positive effect in American political life. But I think Frederick Douglass was just a deeper thinker. You know, he wasn't as prolific a writer. He didn't research things like W.B. Du Bois did, you know, who's more of an academic in some respects. But Frederick Douglass was a deeper thinker than all the rest of the great figures in African American political thought. I mean, I think he had a deeper understanding of rights and a better understanding of the founding than virtually all of his competitors, and he had a better understanding of race than all the founders did. And so I think that, you know, that gives him a powerful claim on our attention.
Well, thank you so much. That certainly does. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. What a great way to engage on this Martin Luther King Day to remember a great American, Frederick Douglass. If you want to learn more about Ashbrook, if you don't know us, please look us up at ashbrook.org. If you're a student or a teacher looking for primary sources, some of the documents that Professor Myers talked about today, we've got them on our website, teachingamericanhistory.org, or just TAH.org. Great resources available for you there. And we will be sending you a link that you can click on to go to the recording of today's broadcast and this seminar. So please do that. Listen to it for yourself again. Send it to your children, grandchildren, friends, students. Make that available to them. We'd be delighted to have them have access to this and to spur their own thinking and their own discovery, again, of a great American. We appreciate you being with us. Our next event for citizens is going to be a major issue lecture series with Dr. Lynn Cheney, former Second Lady of the United States, who will be talking about her book, The Virginia Dynasty, on America's first four of the first 5 presidents of America. So please join us for that. That'll be coming up in the next week. You'll get information about it. It really is our view at Ashbrook that we believe you can learn from history, that we can gain historical perspective on the events, even the events of today. And I think you can see how relevant the discussion of Frederick Douglass is for the events and situation we face today. And also just to renew our understanding and to deepen our understanding of American principles and history. And I think we've done that very well. Thank you again, Peter, for joining us. As always, let's take up the spirit of Frederick Douglass and his hopefulness. Let's please out there today, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and as always, stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you for joining us.